Humanities' flaw, desire for certainty in an uncertain world. Example 4. Byzantium iconclasm dates 726 to 787, 814 to 842. Byzantium iconoclasm experienced between 726 to 787, and for some reason or other they had a second try at it between 814 and 842. What led up to this period was a series of bad decisions by leaders, leading to tragedies for what we call Byzantium, but they called the Roman Empire. Led to some tough questions. If they were God's chosen people, then how could they lose to the quote-unquote infidel? The assumption was God must be angry, that in some way they had sinned, and they were being punished. Question was, what was the sin? In the 6th century, a belief had arisen in the Eastern Church of the intercession of saints. The thought was, in the Old Testament, it said, you must not worship graven images. The argument was that creating icons, such as paintings, was the sin. That is the background, the historical background. Since this isn't a history lesson, but an example of my theory of humanity's flaw, of the need for certainty, I think this should be enough. If you are interested in the history, I hope you will look it up. The reality was leaders making bad decisions, acting out of arrogance instead of wisdom. A rot had entered into the system. The best ally an enemy can have is if your leaders are so blinded by selfish desires, they lose sight of the well-being of their citizens. Leaders place their own wants and comforts over the needs of the country. But admitting that would have led to a collapse in the citizens' trust that they were chosen by God, blessed and destined to be God's chosen. Doubt would have been planted, leading to more turmoil, and leaders reasoned they needed a scapegoat. Whether they honestly thought that at the time or just simply couldn't face the reality, I don't know. Since the question was on God's abandonment, and God is perfect, the easiest answer was to be found in quote-unquote God's Word. As you notice from the Council of Nicaea, my last video in this series, the Bible was selected under the guidance of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the year 325 as to what was accepted to be taught as Christian dogma. Anyway, the Old Testament provided a scapegoat, since most of those books highlights the ideas of a God we should fear. And just as an aside, if God gave us free will, then why would He arbitrarily punish you for choosing your own path? That's just an aside. These are circular arguments, so I'll leave that where it is, since it has no bearing on the argument of my theory. Once an error is made by one generation, it takes many generations to undo because knowledge is lost. And even though God gave us free will, for many the desire is for certainty. And sometimes we give up freedom that God gave us for that certainty. And that means following those who act like they're certain that they know more than those that are following. The reason it takes many generations to undo a mistake is because it is difficult to face the reality. Everything you believe in might have been based on a shaky foundation. Errors at first are made for expedience. We think only of today, and what makes sense to us, we keep, and we discard what we think is inconvenient or no longer makes sense to us. With each generation, what was hard-earned knowledge is forgotten, because those that remember why die out, and those that follow no longer see the value, since the problems it fixed haven't arisen again. Exactly because, through the wisdom of others, it accomplished what it was intended to do. So, what one generation learned through pain and suffering, their offspring loses, dooming a future generation to suffer those tragedies all over again. Because a few in positions of influence at some point arrogantly believe they were wiser than their forefathers. Knowledge moves forward. Lost wisdom is what leads to history repeating itself. There is no cure, but it can be managed, like high blood pressure, through heavy doses of humility. Sadly, humility is not something we produce, something we value. When everything is great, we ignore the pain of others until they've had enough and fight back. And during the conflict, many who before ignored the words angrily demand punishment or violence and say, first, the other side must negotiate. While the other side gets frustrated because they already tried talking and was ignored. Because if you're not the one suffering, you don't see why you should change what you know works so well. That is an example of what I believe is a flaw in humanity, and it repeats itself over many generations. Thank you. The Les Miserables play and book I take some inspiration from. It can be disheartening, however, consider that Jean Valjean accepted his flaws, learned from the experiences, and always seemed to get what he needed, even if it wasn't in the way or time he wanted it. Javert, who blindly followed a rigid earthly life, believing that there was only one path, in the end was faced with the reality everything he always believed might be wrong. All his life he followed, never questioning, and faced with the real doubt, he chose to end it all than to learn and move on. There is one true path. Jean Valjean, having humility from the suffering he already endured, was able to be more self-aware. Earth is a place to learn. If things of earth is all you see and value, then you will never struggle, since you believe there is nothing more. You could be right, but your existence will be empty, since you have nothing to struggle for. You'll just party until you die, having never learned how to reach beyond yourself.